were trying to force some Indians off their land. And they fought a couple of battles, and it finally culminated right here. William Henry Harrison had a young lieutenant serving under him named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln fought in this battle. It's the only military experience he ever had in his life. So they won the Battle of Tippecanoe. The reason that's important is because it gave William Henry Harrison his name. And the reason that's important, remember in 1840, William Henry Harrison was a Whig, okay? And they wanted to win the White House back from the Jacksonian Democrats. So they're going to copy the same thing Jackson did to get elected. Andrew Jackson was famous for the Battle of New Orleans. William Henry Harrison will be famous for this battle. Okay, so that's why this is important. Okay, these two right here. In the years leading up to the War of 1812, okay, the United States is expanding. Okay, it's expanding down south, and it's starting to butt up against the Spanish possession of Florida. Okay, this is before the Adams-on-These treaty, so we haven't got Florida yet. So it's butting up against Florida, and Florida has become sort of a refuge. Okay, runaway slaves are going into Florida. The Spanish will protect them there. Okay, Indians are going into Florida and coming back into Georgia and raiding. So James Madison will send an army expedition down into Florida to try to tame these. These Indians here do not belong to a tribe. Okay, they belong to a group. They call themselves the Seminoles. There is no such thing as a Seminole Indian. Okay, if you look at a tribal group as being a blood-red cultural group, there's no such thing as a Sioux. Okay, the Seminoles were made up of Cherokee and Creek and things like this. Jackson went down there and they fought a series of 3 Seminole wars. Okay, all these wars did was push these Indians down into Florida, all the way down into a point where the Americans could not fight them anymore. And that point was south of present-day Lake Okeechobee in an area we call the Everglades. They pushed them into the swamps, okay? So this is what you need to know about this. This is a series of wars fought between the United States and Seminole Indians to push them down into Florida, to try to isolate them. And it's kind of cool because they're still there. If you go down to South Florida, and we lived down there a few years, there is no Seminole reservation down there. Okay, there are tons of Indians, and there are tons of these people, but there's no Seminole reservation because Seminole is not a racial tribal group. It's called the Miccosukee Reservation because both those Indians share that bloodline. Okay? Horseshoe Bend. When the War of 1812 broke out, because most of the war was being fought in the north, okay, there were still Indian problems in the south. As soon as Andrew Jackson got through dealing with the Seminoles, he came up into the territory of Alabama. Okay? There in Alabama, there was a white settlement called Fort Mims. Okay? The Indians known as Red Sticks. The Red Stick Indians attacked it and slaughtered every white in the fort. Jackson's orders from the Secretary of War, James Calhoun, was solve the problem. Get rid of it. So Jackson chased these Indians around Alabama for the longest time. The cumulative battle was the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Okay? Horseshoe Bend is going to reveal the depth of hatred and prejudice between whites and Indians. It was an absolute slaughter. Okay? The best accounting of this battle we got was from Andrew Jackson's second in command. His second in command was Sam Houston. And Houston wrote a book about this battle. And he said that one thing they did was sit back, and they had all these Indian prisoners. Okay? They put them in a teepee together, and they locked them in there and set it on fire. They burned them all. And they said the fire was so hot they cooked their dinner over it. Okay? And again, this is just showing absolute no respect for all. So again, Horseshoe Bend is going to be an example of the barbarity of the Indian Wars. Okay? Jackson will get a reputation for being a fierce Indian fighter from this one. The next call he gets from James Madison will be to go to New Orleans and save it from the British. Okay? So these right here are pretty much Indian wars. And guys, this is what's important to remember about it. They're all Indian wars and things that are pushing Indians back. Indians are making their last stand. If you're an Indian, you can do one of two things. You can go out there and fight the whites coming at you, or you can go out there and destroy the whites that are already there. You can slaughter the settlers and things like that, okay? The same thing, what you're trying to protect yourself, right? Okay. Of course, you know what this is. After Jackson gets elected president, you start to have this issue down in Georgia. And I'll go down to this while we're at it, okay? The Cherokee have been one of those groups of Indians that decided assimilation was the way to go, okay? Did we talk about Washington's letter Have you not heard about that? Okay. When George Washington gave his farewell address, okay, he also put out a letter to the Cherokee. And what he's saying is this: if you want to stay in your ancestral home, and guys, never forget what we talked about as far as pre-Columbian America. These are people who came over in the boat across the land bridge, okay? They came down the coast of California. They walked across the bottom of the American South, and they stopped in the American Southeast because that's where they could be sedentary. That's where they could grow the Three Sisters. Remember, when you stop chasing your food and start growing it, you're civilized. And that's where these people had been. So Washington told the Cherokee, if you want to stay where you have been for 30,000 years, okay, you've got to have the realization that the white man is not going away. They're not. They're more and more and more going to come. You can't fight them. You can't win. So learn to live with them. So the first time in American history we hear about this issue of assimilation, as far as the United States is from George Washington. He's telling the Cherokees, teach your women to sew. Teach yourself to plant foods that you not only eat, but you can sell, because you become capitalists then. So this is what the Cherokee did. The Cherokee were called the civilized tribe, and the reason is they adopted the American form of government. They had an elected form of government. They had their own constitution. They had their own alphabet. So they were considered the one tribe that had assimilated most, all right? That's why this got to be such a problem. When white farmers started moving into Georgia and came in contact with the Cherokee, all they knew is the Cherokee are squatting there on prime cotton farming land. They've got to go. The state of Georgia tried to expel them. They tried to force them to leave. When they did, one of these Cherokee officials went to Washington and filed a lawsuit, okay? This is the Marshall Court. This is the Marshall Court, okay? And the Marshall Court's going to always rule in favor of the federal government. So in this court case right here, the way Marshall rules is this, is the United States government cannot expel the state of Georgia cannot expel the Cherokee, okay? Only the government can do that, okay? The state of Georgia can't do it. So Georgia, back off, they're going to stay where they're at. So Marshall's going to rule in favor of the Indians, okay? By implication, what he's saying this, the state of Georgia can't make them leave, but the federal government can, all right? And no one's going to try that out until him, okay? Jackson knows what's happening here. So Jackson says, okay, fine. The state does have to move them. I'll move them. So they pushed the Indian Removal Act through Congress. Now, something really important. You may read this document on the test. The Indian Removal Act is one of those things where you've got to look at fact per perspective, okay? If you read it, and I tried to put some of it on one of your tests this year. If you read this thing, this is what Jackson says. We're doing this for two reasons. Okay, number one, we can't stop the flow of whites coming into the United States. They are eventually going to overwhelm these Indians and kill every one of them. How do I know that? Because it's been going on since Jamestown. This issue of whites moving into Indian territory and slaughtering Indians will never stop until they're all gone. Okay? So if we leave them here, they will die. They'll kill whites, white will kill them. It'll be a huge bloodbath. Okay? So it is the opinion of the federal government that the best thing to do for these people is to move them out of the way of white encroachment. Okay? He is going to move them across the Mississippi into the Indian Territory, which will later become known as Oklahoma. Okay? So in the Indian Removal Act, it says we're removing them for their own good. We're removing them so they can maintain their culture. Okay? That's what it says. Is that the only reason they moved them? Remember, guys, this is politics. You've got to read between the lines, okay? Andrew Jackson was a Southerner. He was a plantation owner. He was a cotton farmer, okay? So he has a lot in common with these people. So there are two real reasons here. Another reason is Andrew Jackson hated Indians. He proved that at Horseshoe Bend, okay? So there's a little bit of him and his own racial prejudice that's involved in this. But there's a little bit of the practicality. If we don't get these Indians out of here, blood's going to flow, because it's been flowing since 1607. So when you look at the Indian Removal Act, keep that in mind. Keep it in mind. It's important. Especially if you're discussing it and the rubric calls for complexity. If you talk about this, because guys, most people think this thing is one of the most horrible, it's right up there with the Holocaust. Because all these Indians were expelled, and of course they went on the Trail of Tears, okay? It was horrific. It was a tragedy, okay? But there was another reason to it simply by getting rid of Indians. And in the act itself, it says we're trying to help them preserve their culture, okay? That's the way, when you address something like that, that's your complexity. Guys, in American history, no matter how much bias you have, there's always another side to it. There's always another perspective. And when you're writing your paragraphs and things, try to find that perspective. Mention it, okay? Okay. This is, of course, the Trail of Tears, when the Indians were kicked out of Georgia. For years and years, and they wrote it last year, so you can ask singers and they'll tell you how lucky you are, okay? The DBQ we wrote was the Indian DBQ. The Indian DBQ had 27 documents on it. It was massive. It took most kids about 2.5, 3 weeks to finish. Every day at lunchtime, they were in the room working on this thing. And the reason is we looked at the Native American white experience from Jamestown all the way to Wounded Knee, okay? And one of the key questions was the relationship between the United States and Indians. Was it violent because of the nature of whites trying to move them, or was it genocide? Was it intentional? And some of the best essays I've ever got came out of that, because kids tend to have emotional attachment to it. They stood their ground and made it, okay? So again, always keep this in mind. This is a very emotional issue, okay? You're talking about people who are Aboriginal, okay? They're not really sophisticated. They don't have any machines. The only machine they have are guns they get from white people, okay? And they're being pushed out by a monolith. And they're holding on to their existence with everything they have. And every time they do something that works for them, it comes back against them, okay? This is a trend that goes on and on. And never forget the catalyst. The catalyst for this is always land. It's always land. Always remember this about Native Americans and whites. Native Americans look at land as part of their spiritual universe. Okay? To them, Mother Earth means just that. It's their mother. It gives them nourishment. Okay? It gives them food. So they have a spiritual connection to the land. Europeans want to make money off of it. That's a huge thing to keep in mind. That's a huge thing to keep in mind. Native Americans can't even comprehend paying for land. To them, how can you own God? How can you own the water? How can you own the wind? It just doesn't make any sense, and their worldview doesn't make any sense. Europeans are saying, how can you have that land and not make money off of it? How can you grow all that corn and not want to sell it? So you're talking about two major cultural differences here, okay? That's extremely important. If you have any Indian DBQ, short answer anything, be sure to mention that, okay? Because that provides the context for all this violence. Everybody see what I'm talking about? Okay? Okay.